Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Demai. We're up to Perek Mishnah Tet. The previous Mishnah taught us you're allowed to designate Terumah and Maaser from one batch of definite tevel for another batch of definite tevel, even if you bought them from separate owners. The Mishnah is going to discuss now, let's say one of the batches was bought from a goy. As a preface, Rabotai, there's a machloket Tanaim, there's a machloket amongst the Tanaim, whether produce that was grown in Eretz Yisrael on the land owned by a goy, if it's subject to the obligation of Terumah and Maaser. It's called Yesh Kinyan o En Kinyan Oved Kuchavim Be'eretz Yisrael Avkia Min HaMaaser. Does a goy have the ability to remove the obligation of Terumah and Maaser on produce that he grows on his land in Eretz Yisrael? The following Mishnah is based off the view of Rabbi Meir that the goy does not have the ability to remove the obligation of Terumah and Maaser. Therefore, if a Jew were to buy produce that a goy grew on his own land in Eretz Yisrael, he will have to separate Terumah and Maaser. That's not the halakha the Rab says. Halakha is that the Jew would not have to separate Terumah and Maaser. The goy's produce is exempt. But again, the Mishnah is going to follow the view of Rabbi Meir that the goy's produce is obligated into Terumah and Maaser. Mishnah says, Masrin Mishel Yisrael Shel Oved Kuchavim, Mishel Oved Kuchavim, Mishel Oved Kuchavim. You're allowed to tithe from a tevel of a Jew for the tevel you bought from a goy, and from a tevel you bought from a goy for the tevel of a Jew, because again, according to Rabbi Meir, the Mishnah, both batches are equally obligated in removing tevel, in removing the tithes from the produce. Mishel Yisrael Shel Kutim, Mishel Kutim, Mashel Kutim. You're allowed to tithe from the tevel of a Jew for the tevel you bought from a kuti, and from the tevel of one kuti for the tevel of another kuti. The Rav says, Perot Kutim Vadai Tevel Muchinotan. The produce of a kuti are 100% considered tevel when they sell it. They do not tithe it. Therefore, it shares the same obligation as another kuti's produce or as the Jew's tevel produce, and you could tithe from one on behalf of the other. Even though when the kutim eat the produce themselves, they tithe it. When they sell it, they do not tithe it. They're not concerned with causing somebody else to sin. Therefore, they sell it untithed. Therefore, we know that it's considered vadei tevel. We can separate from it on behalf of our produce or vice versa. Rabbi Eliezer Osel Mishel Kutim Al Shel Kutim. The Mishnah concludes Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with this last ruling. He says you're now to separate tevel from one kuti for the tevel of another kuti, because maybe one of them tithed this produce and the other one didn't, and you're going to end up separating. You're going to take tithes and produce as exempt on behalf of produce that is obligated. And the Rav says, what's Rabbi Eliezer's concern? Sometimes the kuti will decide to eat the produce himself, therefore he'll tithe it, because for himself he tithes it, and then last minute he'll sell it, change his mind and he'll sell it. What happens now? Maybe the produce you have in your hand from one kuti is tithed, and the produce from the other kuti is not tithed, and you're going to end up separating something to umah from something that's obligated on something that's exempt, or vice versa. The Rav does conclude, nowadays, kutim are considered goyim 100%, so even Rabbi Eliezer would agree, there's no concern that they're going to tithe it before they eat it, because they don't tithe it at all. Therefore, even Rabbi Eliezer would say you could tithe from one kuti's produce on behalf of the other kuti's produce. That is in Rabotai of Mishnah Tet. And just to point out, the Tana Kama disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer's concern, because he says that it's very rare for the person to change his mind. Once he decides to eat it, we don't have to assume now that now he's going to sell it, and therefore you have the possibility maybe he tithed it and he sold it while it's tithed. That is the Rabotai Mishnah Tet. Mishnah Yud now, most of the perek we discussed that you cannot separate Terumah and Maaser from produce that's exempt on behalf of produce which is obligated, or vice versa. Now we're going to discuss, can I separate produce that is biblically obligated in Terumah and Maaser on behalf of produce that's rabbinically obligated, or vice versa. Just as an introduction, we're going to be speaking about something called Atzitz Nakuv and Atzitz Sheno Nakuv. Atzitz Nakuv is a flower pot that has a hole. So the Mishnah says like this, Atzitz Nakuv areze ka'aretz. Produce that you grew in a flower pot that has a hole in it, it's considered like produce that grew in the ground. Why? Because the plant draws nourishment from the ground beneath it through the hole. The Mishnah Masechet Uktzin says the hole has to be the size of a small root. The Rav says it's slightly smaller than the size of an olive. Now, it's not actually necessary to have a root pass through the hole in order for it to be considered that grew in the ground. As long as the hole is large enough that a small root could pass through it, the plant can absorb nutrients from the ground through it. Therefore, since it's considered like produce that grew on the ground, it's subject to the obligation of Terumah and Maaser biblically. Therefore, the Mishnah says, Taram me'aretz al atzitz nakuv, me'atzitz nakuv al haaretz terumatot terumah. If you separated terumah from produce that grew from the ground, for produce that grew in a flower pot with the hole, or vice versa, from produce that grew in a flower pot with the hole for produce that grew from the ground, the terumah is considered valid, because again, since there's no halachic difference between produce that grew in the ground and produce that grew in a flower pot with the hole in it, they share the same biblical obligation. You could separate from one on behalf of the other. However, unlike the produce of a flower pot with the hole, the produce of a flower pot that does not have a hole is not considered as a grew from the ground, and the obligation to tithe is one midrabanan. Therefore, the Mishnah says like this: Mishe'enu nakuv ala nakuv. If you separated terumah from produce of a flower pot without a hole for the produce of a flower pot with a hole, which means you separated terumah from produce that is biblically exempt, it has no hole, on behalf of produce that's biblically obligated, it has a hole, terumah, whatever you separated, we treat as terumah, you have to give to the Kohen. But you have to separate terumah again in order to permit what grew in the flower pot with the hole, because the first terumah was invalid on a biblical level. What'd you do? You took produce from a flower pot with no hole and said, I wanted to count for the produce of the flower pot with the hole. You took something as the Rabbanan, you're trying to exempt the Teraita. That does not work. The Torah didn't view the first plant as obligated in terumah at all. Therefore, you have to give whatever you took to the Kohen. The Mefarshim explain, produce that is only obligated midrabanan is biblically exempt from the tithes. Therefore, on the Torah level, whatever you took from the flower pot without the hole to use as terumah, and myself for the whatever grew in the hole is considered like something exempt and something obligated. That's not affected. However, the separated portion, even though it's not really considered terumah, we treat as terumah in the sense that you have to give it to the Kohen, because again, since it was designated as terumah, and people think of it as terumah because it's something midrabanan terumah, therefore we don't give it to the Kohen. People are going to be mizalzel. They're going to start treating real terumah carelessly, so we say give it to the Kohen, but you cannot eat the produce of the flower pot with the hole until you tithe it again. Now, the reverse case, mina nakuv al sheno nakuv, if you separate terumah from the produce of a flower pot with the hole, for the produce of a flower pot without a hole, which means you took terumah from something that's biblically obligated on behalf of something that's biblically exempt, terumah, whatever you separate is considered terumah. But again, since it's tevel on a biblical level, the Kohen cannot eat it until the owner takes out terumot u'masrot. What's the case, Rabotai? The terumah in this case, you separate it from something that's biblically obligated for something that's only rabbinically obligated. A separation according to the Torah was not valid. Why? You took something exempt obligated on something exempt. Therefore, whatever you separate, it remains tevel, and the Kohen is biblically asur to eat whatever you took from it. However, you have to give it to the Kohen, because again, on a rabbinic level, you separated it from something that is obligated and exempted it from the obligation. Therefore, it becomes terumah b'darabanan. However, the obligation to remove the terumah myself from the portion and give to the Kohen, the owner has to separate. And the reason in the previous case we didn't say that the Kohen cannot eat it until you tithe it is because whatever you gave the Kohen in that case, it didn't have to be tied under a biblical law. You took something from a tzitz she'enu nakub that has no hole. It was a flower pot without a hole. So once the rabbi said give it to the Kohen, they allowed the Kohen to eat it. But in this case, you took from produce that had a hole, took from something that's biblically obligated. Since the produce is biblically still tevel, the Kohen cannot eat until you remove the tithes. That is the end of today's Mishna Yomi, Rabotai. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.